Hello, hello. All right, all right. Good morning, good people. Y'all doing all right? All right, see, I'm from that old Baptist church, man. So when I ask a question, I need some volume when to get it back. I'm not used to the mufflers. Y'all doing all right? All right, all right. So I am Adam Coleman, the host of the first panel, the only person up here without a doctorate, but I'm happy to be here amongst the distinguished guests. We're going to start off with just jump right in, man. Get the sparks flying, all right? So I'm going to start with my left because I'm left-handed, so I'll start to the left hand of the panel. In 2 minutes or less, I'm going to stress that because I know we got some preachers on the panel. In 2 minutes or less, please state your position on this question, is there a God, and give your primary reasons for holding that stance.
First of all, I want to say thank you for being here. Thank you, Lisa, for having me, and thanks for this important question. There are many arguments for and against the existence of God. Most of them are couched within a Western intellectual tradition. Two historic prominent ones are the ontological argument that deduces that God exists based on logical conclusions. One famous one is that of Anselm of Canterbury. He said, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So there must be a God. Then the second is a cosmological argument, that God is the cause of all things that came to be. In other words, look at the world in its beauty and splendor. There must be a mastermind or cause behind it. Now, my answer to the question, however, involves reflections on Paul Tillich's notion of the ground of being. God is not a being, as the ontological argument postulates. God is the ground or foundation of being, distinct from being, but causes all things to be, kind of like the cosmological argument. Tillich moves away from the anthropomorphic notion of a personal God or Savior. He wants to conceive of God as broader in scope. This is something Tillich worried about until he died. Now, I agree with Tillich that God is something like the ground of being, yet the problem with the Western arguments is that the structure of the arguments is linear. An African-informed argument is relational, circular, and integrated in human experience. An argument that follows is that God exists because we experience God. So the question is different. God obviously exists because human beings experience God. So the question is whether we acknowledge God. It's kind of like the Holocaust, chattel slavery, Jim Crow. These are human experiences, not merely ideas. The Western approach to the argument for the existence of God presupposes that God is an idea, something to be imagined. So the question, if they existed, speaking of the chattel slavery and the Holocaust, if they existed or occurred, the question if they existed or occurred is laughable, particularly of those who experience them and those who are connected to them, some historical, maybe family tradition. So the question is not, did the Holocaust exist? Did chattel slavery exist? Because those are human experiences. The question is, are we going to acknowledge it? Now, there is some weakness there because Holocaust is not God. Chattel slavery is not God. But the point there is human experience is the driving decider as to whether something exists. The same is with God. God is not an idea to be rationed. God is involved with human experience, even when we can't understand God's role. So the question for me is not, does God exist? The question is, how do we acknowledge God in human existence?
All right, now. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah, y'all can clap.
All right.
Don't be scared. That's cool. All right, brother.
Yeah, so thank you so much. So the question, does God exist? For me, yes, absolutely, absolutely. I'm actually in this for more than just logical coherence, but I'm actually in this for salvation, and amen. And not to say that logical coherence does not matter, but I think at the end of the day, the question of our own vulnerabilities, the question of our need to be protected, kept, rescued, goes further than goes further and deeper than the question of, am I consistent? Am I thinking consistently? In September 23rd, 1955, despite clear and compelling evidence of an all-white jury found Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam not guilty of the murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till after only 1 hour of deliberation. Protected against double jeopardy, the two men publicly admitted in a 1956 interview with Look magazine that they had tortured and murdered the boy, selling the story of how they did it for $4,000. Millam and Bryant were never brought to justice, and both later died after living decades after the fact, died of cancer in 1981 and 1994, respectively, walking around as free people. If there is no God, my question, my concern is who will bring personal justice for Emmett and Mamie Till? Who will bring justice for the 5,000 lynched black men, women, and children whose murderers almost always walked away free, quote, killed at the hands of persons unknown? Not justice in their memory, not justice in their name, not just justice for their people, but who will bring justice for Emmett himself? How will he experience justice? How will Mamie Till experience justice for herself? Emmett and Mamie deserve to see justice with their own eyes. Also, hope beyond human limitations. People on the bottom want someone who is stronger than the forces who are over them, that can guarantee that even if we lose the battle on behalf of justice, that the war will ultimately be won. In some ways, the issues, again, of vulnerability are even deeper for us than logical consistency. We need a guarantee that truth crushed to earth will rise again, that life is more fundamental than death, that justice is more fundamental than injustice, that love is more fundamental than hate, and that though the moral arc of the universe is long, somehow a greater force than us is guaranteeing that it will bend toward justice. And I believe that rather than make us passive, this is a hope that will actually fuel moral action against unjust powers and principalities. That's precisely why some of our greatest freedom fighters have appealed precisely to their faith as the reason to continue despite personal and societal limitations. In his famous kitchen vision of 1956, Martin Luther King Jr., when contemplating leaving the movement altogether after only a few months in the movement, was actually led by the personal, powerful God who makes a way out of no way to continue in the cause for justice. Finally, being made in God's image actually grounds our dignity and offers a moral imagination that, again, goes beyond the limitations of unjust society. It was God who told us that we should be free, despite what the slave master said. It was God that told us that we had dignity, despite what the slave master said. It was God that has given us a prophetic imagination, a moral imagination that allowed us to imagine more for ourselves than even the United States has imagined for us. And so that's why I believe in a personal creator God.
All right, all right. I like how you say you're about that salvation, man. We do have a baptismal pool on premises, so if you want to make that step, Brother Edmonds will meet you in the back.
That's right.
Moving on to you, Dr. Swann.
All right, you see my tech skills there. It's great to be here. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. It's a great event. I'm going to address the same question as my counterparts over here. Got a little bit of a different answer for you. So addressing the question of whether there is or is not a God, there is not a God. Outside the realm of theology, there's nothing evidentiary to suggest that one should believe in a God or anything resembling a God. There exists all sorts of evidence that religion is a human cultural production that serves societal functions such as unifying a populace behind a common theodicy, filling in knowledge gaps amongst a myriad of other functions, but nothing to assert the truth value of the belief. Theism is a learned belief. It's not arrived at through empirical data, logic, or scientific rationale. Again, rather it's a cultural property that is learned, relearned, and passed on. This is why other religions seem implausible, if not completely fantastical, to believers of certain religions, right? Now, I'm gonna go out on a limb and assume nobody out there practices the religion of the ancient Egyptians. No no Horus worshipers out there or practices the religion of the ancient Greeks. And if you do, I apologize, right? But we all recognize these as mythical, right? We even put them in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? And we don't read the Iliad or the Odyssey or similar texts as true, right? To do so is essentially special pleading, right? So too will come a time where contemporary religions are seen as cultural relics of the past, as in the case of ancient Egyptian theology. And so again, returning to the question, there is not a God. There's not a particularly compelling reason to believe in one outside of being prompted to have said belief because of cultural reason, right? And the belief in one is nearly universally simply a function of the current cultural moment. Right? It's the most extraordinary truth claim that a person can make and requires extraordinary evidence. But instead of evidence, we find a dearth of evidence, and it almost always, again, boils down to special pleading, I have special knowledge, and things like that. So again, when we try to ascertain the actual truth value of the question, we arrive at the answer of no. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Actually, you can go ahead and keep this one because they got me back on. All right. Yeah, don't be scared. If you want to clap for him, you can do that too. That's okay. No matter where you fall on the question. Dr. Xavier, what you got for us?
Yeah. Is this on? Okay, great. So let me just express my delight that a space like this still exists and that it's continually being cultivated space, in which sort of, black people of all sort of religious, theological stripes can come to have a dialogue about something that is important. That's what I want to really underscore for me. And so to be able to have a conversation about, is there a God? I want to kind of come at this from a number of different ways. And I'm going to try to be really short because I really want to save the bulk of my time for a conversation. I do mean a conversation because I don't want to say too much right now. So, I'm a bit sort of wary of the question, if I'm honest. Can I be honest with you guys? Okay. Because, this is a courageous conversation, and so I hope that we all can be courageous in all the ways we might sort of desire to be, might need to be, especially intellectually, because a lot is at stake, right now in this world, in this country. And a number of those things are at stake, or planetary even. So I just want to sort of just interrogate for a second the question, and I don't know this answers to this, and we got Dr. Swann here, who is a sociologist. He has, I'm sure, make some interesting data points around this possibly. I don't know how many black people are asking that question. I don't know. Now, I think that's worth thinking about. And if that's the case, let's just postulate for a second, black people are not asking that question as much. So then that might trigger another question, I think. Well, what are they asking when it comes to God, when it comes to sort of how they imagine and understand God? So what are they asking then? If there's a deep presumption that God does exist or does not exist, that's interesting, and that's why we're having this conversation. But I want to sort of think about, what are the kinds of questions that black people are asking with respect to God. And so, but I also don't want to foreclose that all the gods that are in this conversation are deities, because there are some other gods that are made by human hands. And those are the kind of gods, too, that have an immense power over our lives. They're also called idols. So I want to talk about those gods today with y'all, if I can, because those gods have significant influence on the types of people that we become. Some of those guys go by other names, capitalism, building your own brand, building your own capitalistic empire in the name of God, in the name of Jesus. Those gods certainly exist. We need to talk about those this morning, and I'll leave my comments there.
All right, let's talk about it. All right. So I want to go. So you mentioned Dr. Swann in terms of the types of questions that people are asking. I know you referred to you feel there's often an absence of an evidential case for theism in general, and then maybe Christianity specifically. So in regard to these two gentlemen to my left, they laid out some arguments for God's existence. I want you guys to kind of engage with each other's position a little bit, and I'll start with you. Having heard everybody's position on the question, how would you engage those who have an opposite perspective of yours?
Again, thanks for the question. Again, I would say that the claims they're making are simply cases of special pleading, right? And so the idea that we experience God, therefore God must exist, I don't see how that logically follows, right? And it's quite different from the Holocaust and things like that, which are clear in the evidentiary record. There is no arguing against the existence of those sorts of things. But the idea that because someone has had a personal experience that therefore this truth claim is true, it doesn't hold water, right? And unless your brain is wired to conceive of that, it doesn't make any sense. And that's why it doesn't make any sense when you apply it to another religion, or if you applied it to another extraordinary truth claim, right? If I claimed I could fly, there is no believing me unless I showed you, right? And this claim is much more extraordinary than that. So what I think it really boils down to is that non-belief is the default position unless you are taught something. Then non-belief is the default position.
Okay, got you. Dr. Antipas, could you come back on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for your response. I think that the foundation of your criteria for arguing is flawed. You used the very structure that I critiqued to build my argument. Therefore, we don't start in the same place. For one, you talk about empirical evidence, data, compelling reason. When do you decide that it's compelling? The framework you're using is a Western ideological framework that is a slippery slope. That's why we have so many arguments, ontological argument for God, against God. The very notion of linear arguments, deduction, induction, that's framework that you're overlaying to make a judgment about God. And when you do that, you're going to get the conclusions that we've always gotten, trying to get a scientific conclusion on the existence of God. What I'm trying to come at it with an entirely different framework. And even in the way that you argued, you made an understanding of God that's cultural subjected to a superior notion of a empirical God. That in Western education is a problem. If you note in schools, you say you got the, sort of cultural people over here, and then you got you got cultural theology over here. You got systematic theology over here. That's the real theology. And then satisfy culture with this cultural theology. See, Western education has done that to you. But if you go back to, say, slavery, and the ways in which our ancestors were able to hold on to a God in the midst of the type of persecution they went through, they had a whole different way of relating to God that did not make sense in Western categories. So the starting place is different. So the conclusion is going to be different.
Oh, we'll go for it, yeah.
I agree with that, that if we start with different frameworks, we're going to probably end up with different conclusions. But again, I don't think that framework holds. And again, this is a religion that most slaves were coerced into believing. It wasn't something that they brought with them, right? In fact, they were banned from their own cultural practices and religious practices, right? And there were some people that came over that were Christians to begin with, but the vast majority or not practice some form of African traditional religion. And again, the idea that God is so amorphous that he or she is untestable and unverifiable, at that point, I don't see the point in discussing the question anymore. We can't go much further if you're presenting an untestable, unverifiable hypothesis. And I know hypothesis is in the Western tradition. I'm sorry. And I did want to address your argument as well. Who will bring justice for Emmett and Mamie Till? Unfortunately, nobody. It's not a nice thought to have, maybe. It might be a nicer thought to think that there is some sort of ultimate justice. But that's just not how it works, unfortunately, right? Some bad people get away with a lot, right? Our current president, or former president, sorry, included. Talking about Trump. Right? And it's also the morality of torturing someone for eternity is also questionable, but we can leave that to the side. But unfortunately, there is no ultimate arbiter of justice. It'd be a nice notion in a lot of ways, but that it is a nice notion, again, doesn't promote the truth of these kinds of claims.
So, Dr. Edmonds, I want you to respond to that, and then I want to come back to you guys in a moment. I'm really just interested if you guys share that intuition that some sort of moral nihilism follows from the absence of a God. This is kind of interesting, but we'll come back to that. I want you to follow up first.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I would just say, so empiricism is a choice, right? It is a choice. It's not just the default. It's not just all that's really left to us. Right, and it's not sort of the most reasonable kind of choice. It's a choice that is, and it's a definite cultural move to make. And I think that's really what's sort of being asserted. But I would say that it is not the only cultural move to make. And for those who have embraced the faith of Christ. The Christian faith, African Americans who have done that. The story of Christianity and African Americans goes or the stories of Christianity and black folks go much further than the history of colonialism, the history of the slave trade. So it's important for us to recognize that. I'm not willing to concede monotheism to white folks. So that's how I'll respond to that.
I have no arguments against that. I think those are fine points. I might say that empiricism is a sort of better way to ascertain truth, but I agree it's not the only way, and historically, certainly, it's not the only way.
So, Dr. Pink, I want to get you in there and give you an opportunity to respond to some of the arguments for God's existence that have been placed on the table, or anything you feel the need to respond to, but also wondering about that moral question as well. Maybe we can circle back around to that. I know I'm putting a lot on your plate, but you got that doctorate for a reason, so I figured I can do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
listen, somebody better get their money's worth for it.
There you go.
So I don't know what I am or have. These are really stimulating conversations and thoughts and lines of inquiry that are immensely complicated. They really are. There's so much to say. I'll just start here. This is all Western. Listen, black people have been westernized. We can complicate the history as much as we want to complicate it, particularly black people in the U.S. specifically. Like, we're all a part of the West. Nobody escapes that if you're born here. You don't escape it. Now, you might want to try to think about it differently, try to reimagine and all that kind of stuff. That's what black people did when they got here to these shores. That black people undoubtedly was forced into Christianity in particular ways, but they also made some choices to take it on. And they did not just decide to take it on just passively, uncritically. But they did so especially critically. Because black people, listen, I'm going to disabuse us maybe of some ideas, and I'm not a historian of the 17th, 18th century, nor in slave studies. But listen, that black people were brought here to these countries, to this particular country, as someone else's, not just property, but someone else's workhorse. And so, but yet these folks came here, brought here, and they decided to embrace this religion, Christianity. Now, we all know the complicated histories around Christianity was already in Africa, yada, yada, yada. But how Christianity got to this particular country, those two things are both true, all right? And so the thing is, Christianity did not leapfrog from Africa by people who we might identify as African and end up over here in the same fashion, in the same way we might imagine it back then. There's histories of transformations and shifts and that happened the way in which Christianity came down through various parts of Africa, through Europe, through sort of the West, but also to the East, and it made its way over here. That's a complicated history over hundreds of years. And so I said all that to say this is because, we all sort of inherited all kinds of traditions, right? And so, and even the black church in a particular sorts of ways is a Western sort of product. The black church didn't begin in, I don't know, take your pick. Where you want to start? In Kenya or where you want to start it? The sort of what we understand the black church to be is a thoroughly a U.S. phenomena that emerged when it did. How you want to particularize that sort of starting point in the 17th century, 18th century, or the prior. So what I'm saying, this is a really complicated discussion, but I think we have to historicize sort of these sort of arguments in a way that doesn't just lead us to sort of to think about to get so trapped in these metaphysical debates about whether or not God exists without sort of understanding sort of how that even question is itself coming out of a particular historical sort of moment in which we find ourselves in, but have been in for quite some time. That's why I began my comments earlier, reflecting on sort of the question itself. The question that God exists was a particular question that was motivated by European anxieties, intellectual anxieties. And you take your period, take your pick over the last sort of 500 or 600 years. Whether you're in the Reformation period, want to go back before that, there's always been debates on these sorts of issues. But here's the thing: black people wasn't always asking those questions. Even in the U.S., even when they have been inhabited by and inside of this Western imperial sort of structure. So, and I think the fact that black people were not asking that question is worth thinking about. It's worth taking seriously. Everyone to take the lives, not just the lives of black people serious, but the ways in which black people have thought about God and about many things, taking that seriously. But I'll stop there.
All right. Well, I wonder, that comes full circle, back to what Dr. Antipas was saying about that experiential piece. I'm saying, in a sense, and I hear what you're saying about the empirical. And maybe we need to have a conversation offline, because I'm wondering if frameworks like Alvin Plantinga's Reformed Epistemology can kind of bridge the gap between the experience and the way that your framework is structured there. But that's a conversation for another day. Anyway, Brother Evans, I want to come back to you. Like you said, this is a very complicated conversation. So I'm going to complicate it even more, right? Sure. When it comes to whether it be statements that have been made here on the panel or just in your general thought, right. What would you say would be the most formidable argument against your position? And we'll come around for everybody.
Yeah, no question, it's the problem of evil. The problem of evil and suffering is the most formidable question that the theist has to face. It's also, I think, the most formidable question that the atheist also has to face, because we all have to deal with the issue of pain. And as my brother mentioned earlier, he said, look, I think he's taking his position to the logical conclusion. He's saying, look, if there is no God, then there is no justice for Emmett Till. There is no justice for Mamie Till. As a theist, that's unacceptable for me, right? I do believe in the existence of objective moral truths, objective moral values, like justice, truth, love, life. And so I want to say that, that there's an interventionist personal God that actually demonstrates solidarity with us and guarantees the triumph of justice for us. So but I think, yeah, it's no question it's the problem of evil and suffering. That's a question that's at the heart of the black experience in America. It's at the heart of really human experience as well. So.
Okay, I appreciate that. I'm gonna flip-flop a little bit, and I'm actually to come back to you, Dr. Swann. What would you say would be the most formidable argument against your position?
I suppose that the arguments boil down to like sort of two categories of arguments. One we sort of touched on earlier is people reporting personal experiences. I don't want to dismiss them out of hand or tell them that they're lying or whatever, right? And so I believe, of course, that there's a grounded, rational reason for why they had said experience, right? That I would not attribute to the cause of God or the spiritual realm or anything like that. But to have those arguments can be a bit difficult. Again, the second is sort of that God is so amorphous that he is untestable, and again, it's hard to have those arguments. I do not have the compulsion to even really think about belief in God other than when it's presented to me, right? Because I was raised without religion. My brain is really not wired to have those kinds of thoughts. The other sort of formidable one, although I think it engages in special pleading, are arguments of infinite regress. So keep asking why. Eventually me, the atheist, is going to say, I don't know, right? So the biggest question, why is there something rather than nothing? Although I think there are interesting cosmological answers for that, ultimately you could get me to say, I don't know. And that is usually where someone will jump in, aha, that's where God resides, right? That's the evidence for God. But again, I find that special pleading, and you could apply the same sort of logic to the God question. So ultimately, other than not wanting to dismiss other people's personal experiences, I don't see many formidable sort of arguments for the existence of God. As I said, this is an extraordinary truth claim.
Okay, all right. I'm going to give Dr. Antipas the last word on this question. I'm coming to you first, Dr. Xavier.
Couple quick. You say me or him?
I'm sorry, I was confused. I'm going to give you the last word on this question. I'm going to come to him first, and then I'll double back to you. Sorry about that.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know if I have a dog in these fights, but I do think these are important questions that are worth sort of like thinking about and rethinking and reshaping, sort of not just sort of how we imagine the questions are set, but also to think about how we can answer some of these questions differently. And so if the question is something that I guess is on the table is, how did you phrase it again?
Yeah, what would you say is the most formidable argument against your position?
Yeah. I think it's just really hard to have a position on one level, not on this particular subject matter, but just in general. And by that I mean is that if we really understand just by position, do we mean something that, we're willing to fight over, willing to die for, willing to live for, something that we have absolute certainty about, something that can't be doubted, that's for the philosophers in the room, something that is indubitable and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, sure. But no matter how firmly a belief that you have in this life, you have had a question about it. You have questioned it. Let's sort of just be honest about that. So we're not talking about beliefs about which we can be certain, because we cannot be certain. That's why we have the doubt. That's what it means to be human. That's what it means to be in God's image. However you want to sort of, whatever your framework for understanding who we take ourselves to be on this planet. So my view is that, well, like, to begin answering the question like that is to really take seriously sin, evil, and how it just corrodes and corrupts not just our practices, but our judgments and how we think on multiple sort of levels. And the very structures, the very evil structures under which we are forced to think, sometimes in spaces like these. That's everywhere. Everywhere is trying to structure how we are thinking in your church, in your community group, the podcasts you're listening to. And listen, that's all well and good. But whether or not you're an atheist, theistic, or what have you, there's plenty of black people historically. We know this is just objective truth, that a lot of black people are complicated in terms of their religious belief. That the very category of atheism and theism is too narrow. It's too narrow. There's plenty of black folks who have identified both sort of in this century and prior as humanists. But even that's too narrow. And so, so I just think the very terms in which we're trying to imagine the question has to also be sort of reimagined. Listen, I'm not trying to reimagine everything just for the sake of trying to reconstruct and deconstruct. No. But what I'm trying to really sort of point us to is try to get us to think about, the very important things in other modalities. Like, this is just one particular modality that'll help us understand something very important, something about which we care deeply about. Yes, I'm for all of that. So, I agree with many of what these gentlemen have said, but I want to sort of think about some of those things differently. Last thing, and so I guess this kind of moral question that's sort of lingering, particularly, I guess, with respect to what Dr. Micah sort of mentioned around Emmett Till, and justice and what it means to live in a world without God, whether or not morality, and the various forms of ethics or any kind of ethics is really possible. That's a tough question. I mean, William R. Jones, in the 70s, in his sort of significant sort of critique of particular forms of black theology, tried to stab at it. And he asked the question, many of you might be familiar with, maybe not. If you don't, then it's worth sort of knowing that magisterial text. He asked the question, which is the title of the text, is God a white racist? That's the title of the book. If you don't know that book, you need to read it. You got to read the book. Because Jones wanted to say that if you look at the historical evidence, transatlantic slavery in particular, but if you just take the evidence, well, where does God, if God does exist, then God is a white racist. Or we can retranslate it in contemporary sort of parlance. Well, does Black Lives Matter to God? Does God care about Black lives? Right? Like Emmett Till. Right? And we can George Floyd, we go on and on and on. And so, but I just think the intellectual, the cognitive, intellectual, the philosophical is not going to be able to answer that question. It ain't gonna stand up. Because if you try to put that question in that form to try to answer that, it's going to break all the way down. You got to give it up. You might have to give up some of your deep commitments. You got to be willing to be unhoused. Because where's the evidence that God is for justice for George Floyd, or for all other countless black people who have died, have been murdered, been slain, and just brutal. And those are just the people who actually was buried, or at least was dead and might not have been buried. But we're not even talking about the black people who are constantly beat down in other kinds of ways, psychically, emotionally, so forth. Does God show up for that? Sure, yes.
I apologize.
But
I got to jump in
I'll
on
leave it there. So yeah, I know we're going.
Sandman's gonna come out in a second with the cane if we don't move forward. So real quick, I'm sorry, Dr. Antipas, can you? So we can get to the next question.
First, I think that any argument that is cerebrally focused or cognitively focused or epistemologically top down would be an argument against my argument, right? Because I'm arguing from experience. So that's one. The second is, if one asks me, if you believe that God exists based on experience, then explain the experiences of human experience with evil, the theodicy question. One would push my argument in the corner to say, I can't explain God. Then one would say, well, if you can't explain God from experience, then how do you know your argument is true? And my response would be something like, I can explain human reality and existence and I can't even explain all of human behavior. I can't understand why slavery happened, how human beings did that to human beings. I can't explain how people rape other people, but that doesn't negate the reality of the human persons who are doing the behavior. Same as with God. I cannot explain God. I wish I could. That's where faith comes in. And my faith teaches me that while I cannot understand all of God, that I believe in someday I'll understand more about God than I understand today. And so with that said, I think linking back to my brother, I'm a little confused, being a sociologist. How do you enter into a context of people and determine whether their experience is legitimate or not? I mean, phenomenology teaches us that you have to understand people on their own terms. So if you go in to study people and you have already decided that what they experience is not legitimate, then how is that sociological analysis even a legitimate one? You have to take seriously. And when I said about people on slavery and believing in God, I didn't say Christian God. I said God. I was very careful to say that. They brought an understanding of God, however they understood God, many gods, few gods, a lot of gods, God nonetheless. The God consciousness is not new, and it was not imposed on people. God consciousness has been around forever, and all humanity has tried to wrestle with God. Is God many? Is God one? But this idea that God does not exist, history doesn't even bear record that humanity would agree with you on that.
All right, all right. So as we're kind of winding down in our prepared questions, you can shift your focus to where you can scan the QR code and go ahead and ask questions of the panel. I'll bring up here on my handy dandy iPad, I believe, hopefully. Oh, actually I locked them. Oh, here we go. So I'll be bringing those up in just about 5 minutes or so. But until we get there, briefly, gentlemen, I'm going to ask maybe we can cover this next question. The African-American community faces a number of challenges, some of which were mentioned here: economically, justice, a number of, just kind of that suffering and problems of evil, things like that. What does your worldview have to offer in the face of such challenges that the African-American community is facing? I'll start with you, Dr. Swann.
How long do I have?
30 seconds.
All right, the bumper sticker version. I would say that, and again, it's not a pretty selling point, but atheism doesn't offer anything. It is just the freedom from a belief that I feel is not true and has been historically harmful, right? In this country, colonialism, slavery, Jim Crow, separate but equal, even mass incarceration to this day, all these horrible incarnations of white supremacy have been justified by the thumping of a Bible, the killing of Emmett Till, and the acquittal of his murderers were justified by the thumping of a Bible. And I am simply suggesting that a world in which we don't give credence to that is a better world for black folks specifically, but just more so in generally.
Okay, Dr. Antipas, I'll come back to you. 30 seconds.
Ask the question one more time.
Sure, yeah, in terms of like the challenges that African Americans face as a community, what is it that your worldview brings to the table in the face of those challenges? We're talking about justice, economics, and things of that nature, the thriving of our community.
I think the fundamental one word that I'd like to go to is one that may be worn and torn and used too much, but hope. Hope. You take away hope. James Baldwin said, you cannot tell the children there is no hope. How does the future exist without some expectation that there is something better to offer? We would self-destruct. We would not have joy, have no reason to live if we don't have hope. Faith teaches me that although it's Friday, Sunday's coming.
Hey.
All right.
Yeah.
And
Oh, You got
One
5
more
seconds,
piece
yeah.
of that.
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
And God suffers with us on Friday. So God is not just waiting to Sunday. God suffers with us on Friday. That's how I get through the vicissitudes of my own life. My belief does not escape me from the pain. It take me through.
All right,
I feel
now.
like preaching.
Somebody
on today.
break that organ out, Doc. Come on now.
Hey,
As we transition to our Q&A from the crowd. All right. We're going to pass the plate around in a minute. You know what I mean? But or you can hit me up
Say
on my
you
cash
taking
app,
us to
you know what I'm
church,
saying?
man. I don't know if that's fair.
That's a joke.
Hope.
All right. Hey, Dr. Swann, you're a pretty popular guy, man. The first,
Awesome.
I guess the highest rated question that we got from the crowd.
I'm the
First
weirdo.
one's coming to you. You know, you said you do.
I'm the weirdo, yeah.
So it's, it reads, there we go. Bring it up on the screen. Look at that. I'm technological here. Dr. Swann, can you explain what divine special pleading is, and can you expound on this?
So special pleading is the idea that you do not apply the same level of skepticism to your own truth claims, in this case religion, as you would to somebody else's, right? And so there are reasons that people are Christian rather than Muslim, and they hold those reasons very near and dear. Flip that over. There are reasons that people are Muslim rather than Christian. And the way that Christians determine that every other religion is, for lack of a better word, wrong, right, is through special pleading, right? So their extraordinary truth claims are wrong for some reason. Their spiritual claims that don't have any empirical data are wrong for some reason, but mine are correct, right? And it's the idea that you are the possessor of some special knowledge and everybody else, almost by definition, can't be. And that's sort of what special pleading is in about 30 seconds.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. And I'm not 100% sure who this question is for, so I'll just go ahead and open up to everybody. But if belief in God is based on culture, context, or pressures, how do you explain how humans have believed in God since the beginning of time to now with no interruption in that belief? So, man, I'm going to open that up to, I'm good with you, Dr. Davis. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll play around with that question. And if there's others
You can
who
play
wanna
around
jump-
for about 2 minutes.
Yeah.
I'll give you a
No,
minute.
I
I'll
got
give you a minute to play
Yeah,
around.
This is gonna be really short. This is really short.
30
Yeah, no, I appreciate the nudge. Yeah, I mean, listen, there's been plenty of black people historically, even black people, many enslaved, people of African descent who did not believe in God. So that's on historical record too. Many of them was also Muslims. And so, there's some, new research over the last 10 years really trying to document many of this. There's stuff even before that. And so a lot of really important works have been written on trying to excavate this history of black people who didn't believe in God. Now, non-belief in God doesn't amount to atheism. Right, so, and let me just say this, because I want to kind of make something to just, I'll do the conceptual thing for a second, be the philosopher for a second, all that kind of stuff. So we should be very, very sort of slow to reduce religion to theism. You can have religion without theism. You can have spirituality without theism. You can have a sense of the divine. You can have divine consciousness, all kinds without theism. Theism is itself a particular way, Western European way of understanding what we tend to take to be God. But there's other kinds of sort of modalities, epistemically, right? And we notice this experientially as well, coming back to a very important point that's been raised by our dear brother on the other side, Antipas, on this. And so I say that there isn't just to bring this full circle, there isn't a continuous stream of belief in God, on this planet. That stream has always been, it's continuity and discontinuity, all at the same time, side by side, intersecting and the light. And so there isn't that kind of sort of, history hasn't unfolded in quite the way the question might seem to suggest.
Interesting. I feel like you said something that intersects with something you mentioned earlier, Dr. Edmonds, in terms of, you mentioned that theism, maybe you said monotheism to be more specific, is kind of like a Western construct, if you will. You know what I'm saying? That seems to conflict with something you said earlier about the history of Christianity in Africa and so forth.
Yeah.
What would your take be in response to what he just said?
Yeah, the ancient Hebrews would like a word with you, my brother, because monotheism is not a Western. We're talking about an ancient Near Eastern faith here, and so I just the kind of the casual kind of throwing out of, well, this is a Western construct. This is that's just not the case. It's not the case. Certainly. The West has a certain take on this ancient Near Eastern religion, but it certainly is an ancient Eastern religion. That's just a fact. Our Savior, the Christ I serve, was an ancient Near Eastern Semite, right? Who walked the dusty streets of Jerusalem and all the rest of it, right? That was not a Western thing. So so I think we've got to just be honest about that at least. Right.
Yeah, sure, but that wasn't my claim, though. My claim wasn't that it's not Western. My claim is that how we understand, how we interpret, how we sort of think about Jesus, the ancient Near East, the ancient Hebrews is Western. It's not that they were Western, it's that how we think about those things is Western. So, and I think that's an important distinction that oftentimes in debate and sort of conversation, we sort of we're not as intellectually sort of we have to sort of slow down and sort of understanding what we are trying to say and what we think we're hearing, not just on the stage, but just in general in these conversations, because these conversations are already so fraught with all kinds of assumptions that we think the other person might sort of possess that they may or may not possess. And so part of what I'm sort of want to suggest is that, I'm not a Bible scholar. We got some Bible scholars in the room, some Hebrew Bible scholars, New Testament scholars, but I'll dabble for a second just to sort of underscore an important point. I mean, it's not obvious, in terms of particular scholars around the Hebrew, Bible and sort of the history of sort of Israel and, whether or not, at what point did they become monotheists, right? There's certain, claims of henotheism. There's multiple sort of gods, right? And so that were up and running. Now, listen, I'm not here to sort of settle that particular sort of very important debate, but I think part of what I'm trying to suggest is that I made the sort of claim about that religion is not reducible to theism. Monotheism is another kind of theism. What I'm saying is that you can have conceptions of some otherworldliness that's not tied to a particular kind of God concept. You can be Buddhist and not have a God. There's plenty of religions that don't have a God in the way we imagine that, right? And here's the thing, Jesus himself wasn't a Christian, and so did Jesus believe in the Christian God? What kind of God did Jesus believe in? You think it's the same one that y'all believe in the 21st century? So again, I'm not saying there's not point of identification and continuity. What I'm saying, it just may not be simple in the way in which the conversation might seem to suggest, and the ways the question might seem to suggest.
Well, actually, let's address that question. What do you think about that, Dr. Antipas? In terms of, I'm just lobbing it back and forth. You know what I mean? It's like Serena Williams and whoever's going to.
There's a lot of parts to that.
When it comes to the question that the God that Jesus believed in and so forth.
That's true, but I don't think that's the question of the discussion, right? We're discussing whether God exists. Whatever expression of that God, if the argument is that God does not exist, it doesn't matter. But I'm arguing God exists. Now, if the next question is which God or understanding of God is the true God, then that's a different discussion, right? But the original discussion I was responding to is that humanity has always, the prevailing, ruling agreement of all humanity is that there is a ultimate being, God, higher power, whatever. Even the word God was not the name of, in some places called Allah, Uncle Lou, other things, right? So the question is not which one, how should we say it? The question is, does the reality of God exist? That's what I was responding to. And so what part of what? You said a lot
Well,
of stuff.
so now, having said that, I'm gonna push you a little bit now, since
Okay,
I
push
got
me.
the cheat sheet on the questions.
Push me. Now I believe in Jesus. Can I
So
preach
let's talk
Jesus
about
on
Jesus
here
then. Let's go ahead.
All right, brother.
I'm gonna push you
I
a little bit. You know what I
believe
mean?
in
So,
Jesus, my Lord.
What do
And
we
I had
make-
an experience
Okay.
with the risen Lord.
All right, bro. All right.
Oh, glory.
All right.
It's not an intellectual thing.
Now we already
It's
passed
a
the plate around
holistic
once, so
thing.
you can't get a second helping there. We already did that one time. So
Been
for the
to the water,
panel,
been
what do
done.
we make of Jesus and his claims? Because we have kind of talked around it a bit, you know.
that?
But what do we make of Jesus and his claims? So I'll let you continue to answer that.
Which
And then,
claim of Jesus?
What it just says, what do we make of Jesus? And in parentheses, a real man and his claims. So I would assume things like, you know, that he is, you know, the Messiah, that, you know,
Jesus
I would
is
argue
Christ,
that he
the
is
Son of
God
the
and so
living God.
forth, you know.
What I make of it, I had an experience with it. It's hard for me, and that's the way I understood my experience. So it's hard for me to, it is part of the identity of my faith. So what do I think of Jesus? I think he's the Christ, Son of the living God. I believe that Jesus is the invitation to humanity to the economy of the Godhead. So is that a theological question?
Well, they kind of left it vague, you know what I mean? And I understand we've talked already about different frameworks of how to approach, you know, these questions, some from experiential, some from the, you know, kind of more empirical. And so I guess the way I interpret it is when you think about amongst historians, the consensus is that Jesus existed. I mean, as a historical person, that's
Yeah,
really
Jesus
not controversial.
existed, yeah,
But then obviously, in terms of the claims made in the Gospels, what's that?
The religious scholars might get upset with me, and I totally agree. The historicity of Jesus is pretty consensus in that realm, but I do not believe in the historicity of Jesus. So I'm just throwing that out there.
Okay.
You were making the assumption we all agreed. I do not agree with that. If we want to get into that, we can, but just I don't.
So you would hold the position that Jesus, I guess your answer to this question would be that Jesus did not
There's
exist.
a mythological.
He's mythological.
Yeah.
Just like.
So his response to me, though, about the Holocaust is that we know, everybody knows the Holocaust existed. There's no argument about that. So how do you know? Were you there?
I don't know.
All right,
But
so the
there's
same
no
way-
evidence to suggest that he did exist outside of a few very scant written sources. And I would think that like the most powerful being in the universe would have been recognized a little more than that. But that is a compelling reason for me to not believe in these truth claims when there's much more in common with the mythology that we understand as mythology than any evidentiary reasons for believing that. People that do that scholarly work are still bringing these preconceived notions to that work. And again, I think in 50 or 100 years, that consensus will have fallen.
Yeah. So if God is the kind of being that can't be put under a microscope, right? If God, so the kind of God we're talking about is the kind of being that is beyond that. I mean, the God that we are hoping in for salvation can't be reduced to that, right? So, but if we continue to say, well, you know, I won't believe in this God until this God comes to me on my terms and can be put under my microscope, I won't concede that faith, you know. Even science itself has a certain humility. I'm not still in that same world, but I came out of that world, and I recognized, and sort of some of these top physicists and scientists would even say, hey, look, you know, good physics is physics that knows what it does not know. It's physics that is able to say, you know, there's so much of the universe that is unobservable, you know, and actually part of actually having integrity about science is being able to say there's a mystery even to the created universe that even science recognizes, right? So when people so the assertion that because I can't put him under my microscope, therefore he does not exist, is not even borne out in science itself, you know. So
Yeah.
I see you brewing over there, man. You want to come back
Yeah.
on that?
Well, listen, I grew up on these questions. I honestly did, and you know, I was the kid at church who asked, you know, if Jesus died on Friday, got up on Sunday, what happened to the other day? All right. for those, I guess we don't know how many days, right? So, okay, the math, so, okay. So that was me, like from very, very young ages. But having done having sort of, done a lot of different things, served people in a lot of different ways over the years, I think about that question differently. And so part of how I think about it is, and how I want to approach it is like, why does that question matter to us? What's at stake in those questions? I want to talk about that because those are the types of things that sort of really motivates these questions that never get discussed. So whether you believe Jesus is a real person, real historical person or not, what's at stake? What do we take to follow from those particular sort of like ways of thinking about Jesus and the world, right, and ourselves? Because you can believe in Jesus or not and be a terrible person. We know that. We know this. Trump believed in God.
Well,
like, honestly, I mean, he baptized. I mean, Trump got, listen, that's what. So we're gonna say, well, maybe not. So we're in a contest about who's God, whose conception of God.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Now, my brother here says one of the issues is hope, right? So that's an important point, right? Hope matters for how we engage the world today. It does. Another thing is love. Love matters in terms of how we engage the world. Is love just a human construct? Is love something that you could choose or not choose? Or is love something that's more fundamental than hate? Something that goes beyond hate? And the thing about Jesus as a historical figure is that the incarnation is actually the claim that God has come among us as one of us. And that God has put God's self beneath the very worst that evil, sin, and death can dish out. Right? So God demonstrates the ultimate solidarity with us, and on the third day overcomes the worst that evil, sin, and death can dish out on our behalf. Now that's a hope that goes beyond eternity and claims us today, right? And keeps us bound to not just moral action, but a certain kind of moral action. It was when Frederick Douglass was finding himself contemplating responding to slavery and the injustice and violence of slavery with the oppressor's own tools, resorting to cruelty in order to try to fight cruelty. It was Sojourner Truth that actually stood up and asked him the question, Frederick, is God dead? Right? And that question was meant to say that we, because love is greater than hate, because justice is greater than injustice, we have a calling to adhere to a certain way of contending against injustice and violence, right? This is why the Civil Rights Movement had a particular modality, that it was committed to nonviolence as a way of bearing witness to this God of love.
Yeah,
Actually,
I totally agree.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I do want to stay here for a second because that's something that seems to have kind of loomed throughout the conversation is in answer to your question in regard to what are the costs, if you will, of the question itself, that what's at stake. I know that this notion of morality has kind of loomed in the background, right? So I do want to ask, like, if God is off the table, then how do you ground morality? Like, how do you ground objective morals or not, or what have you? And then what would be the implications of that in terms of if God and morality go out the window, what are the implications then for the black community, humanity, or what have you?
Yeah, no, I think, one could believe 100% of what Dr. Mika just said and treat everybody in here like they're not even a human being, much less a Christian. So this is really important because it's not just about what you believe. It's not about just having the correct belief. It's just not. So, because if this is about trying to have the right belief or trying to be 90% accurate on the God questions of existence, 80%, 99%, however you base it in your experience, based upon logical coherence, if it's about that, we all gonna lose. Because guess what? All the empirical data suggests, and our own lives too, by the way, that we all act contrary to our beliefs. Every single one of us is inescapable. So you can have the right beliefs and still be a screwed up person and still do screwed up things, which is to say you can still act in ways that actually you might be a practical atheist, as they used to say. I don't know if that term's still used these days. So my point is that, like, what are we after by suggesting or implying that if you don't have God, the world is going to be X, Y, Z, or if you do have God, the world is going to be X, Y, Z?
guess what? The world's going to be X, Y, Z, whatever we think about it. That's what's going to be. Now, here's the thing. You might want to have some better ways to think about when things happen in the world and things happen to your life. So that's when a particular sort of framework, a religious framework, Christian framework, Afro-Protestant framework, whatever that framework is, religious or otherwise, might be very helpful to have. But we have to know that's actually what's going on. And so as opposed to trying to sort of to operate from a deep presupposition that, our particular sort of vantage point is the only possible vantage point from understanding anything, much less God. It's our particular vantage point. That's why I said earlier, Jesus was a first-century Palestinian Jew. So, that matters. So how Jesus understood himself, how Paul understood Jesus, years later, how some of his disciples understand Jesus and God, those are significant differences the way we imagine. We're in a different universe than they were in the 21st century. We're driving cars, we're on the internet, we're on Facebook, on and on and on. And so that shapes how we understand so much of ourselves and how much we understand, these sorts of ideals and deep commitments, like God, which is among, I would imagine, our most ultimate and deepest commitments. And by that I mean, just really quickly, is that we all have them, whether you're atheist, theist, humanist, secularist, free thinker, what have you. We all have ultimate commitments, the types of things that we cannot get behind, the things that we can't argue for. And God is right there with it. And we just got to be honest, listen, there are some things I'm just not willing to let go. I'm not willing to let go what happened, the experience I had, wherever it was when I encountered God in Jesus. That's okay. We don't have to have these, rational and theological debates as if sort of we need to sort of engage in a kind of seemingly maybe, legitimacy, credibility, if we can have better arguments. That's a lot of precisely what problem, why the European sort of intellectual traditions of various sorts fell apart. But that's a whole nother conversation for another day.
Well, so now in terms of that letting go that you mentioned, that's kind of where I was trying to get to, because from your perspective, Dr. Swann, part of that letting go is that if God, well, I guess you say you didn't grow up religious, so it wasn't a letting go, but if we let go of God, religion, and so forth, is your perspective then that we have to also let go of morality in some objective sense? Is that do you feel that's an entailment of what your view is?
That is a very complicated question.
Okay.
One, I would say that there would be no ultimate arbiter of justice, and so in that sense, there's no objective, top-down sort of morality. It has to be this way. I do think that morality evolves naturally within societies. If you look at lots of studies, we do have certain things that, people shirk away from and things like that, right? You can sort of see that in the human genome, and I think there's lots of ways to get at morality besides the God route. But again, there is no, from that point, saying this is the way to be moral. That I do not think that exists. We sort of have to find our own way. We can't appeal to something greater than us. We are the ones who decide what's moral, what's ethical, and we do that through reasoned argument and experience and stuff like that.
Got you. Dr. Antipas, when it comes to that moral aspect of the human experience, does that somehow intersect with what you were conveying earlier? Where does morality fit into that human experience? Do you feel like that's an aspect of sensing God, or do you feel like there's any implication in terms of our experience with God that has to do with morality?
Yeah, I think that the need for moral compass is a witness that we also need God, and there is a God to provide that. Because, again, I want to affirm my brother's perspective because I affirm you as a human person and an intelligent scholar. I do think, though, that if there is no moral framework, then we don't have anything to build on. And that common moral framework, good, you can be a good person, love, the need for love, the need for hope, all of that is a witness in itself that there is a need for something else other than human decision. We have to turn to something else. I want to punch you out. I want to kill you. But I'm grounded by a moral framework that is beyond me, that teaches me that that's not the way to do it. That's not the way to behave. That's why I apologize when I do wrong. That's why I want to be better, because there is the call of the moral universe that witnesses to an ultimate being that is driving humanity, drawing humanity to the God of love, the God of hope, the God of peace, that only witnesses that there is a God. We may not want to agree on how to explain that God, but there's something there.
Could I just respond 2 seconds with a
Please,
real
yeah.
quick sort of question? So, is it moral to do something because God said so, or is it moral to do something because it's right, or you think it's right? And I think that's a really interesting question. We don't have time to discuss it now, right? But the idea that just because there's this, so supposedly this being, and he has set forward these rules, I'm going to follow that, is that I'm not even sure that gets at what we mean by morality in a lot of ways. Following pre-prescribed notions is you're not on the moral playing field in a lot of ways if you're following pre-prescribed notions. So I would say, in a lot of ways, I'm not sure the question really maps on to certain ways of talking about morality.
So like, is something good because God declares it's good, or is it good in and of itself and God aligns with it? There's a version of the Euthyphro dilemma.
Yeah,
Right.
that
Is there something you want to
that often sets up a false dichotomy, though, because it sort of positions morality over here or the good over here, positions God over there, and says, if God says it because it's good, then that thing must be sort of equally powerful, or sort of as great as God, or perhaps antecedent to God, or something like that. But that kind of sets up I would say a false dichotomy, because the kind of God that we are espousing is the God that is in God's self-goodness, right? So it's not as though God is appealing to some goodness outside of God's self to make a claim or to make a command, right? And I'm not sure that it is immoral or goes beyond morality to walk in accord with pre-prescribed notions, especially if those notions come from the good God. So I'm not sure I follow that.
But I don't think the question necessarily presumes that, though, necessarily. I mean, I think the presupposition that you brought that's not built into this question is the presupposition of God's goodness. Like, God can just be an empty concept, right? Just is part of what the Euthyphro is trying to get at is, I think what you're trying to sort of say, well, we shouldn't draw that far of a wedge. And I think if we don't know what God is like in God's self, if we just actually take that seriously, then I think, because if we're honest, we don't know what God like in God's self, unless anybody here does, or want to be willing to think they do. So we don't actually know that. Now, we have a Bible, we have some stories, have some narratives, right? We have people who testify of having heard from God and that sort of, and we take it seriously. It's written down in a book. It's okay. But that's still not what God is in God's self. Right. We're clear on that? I mean, honestly, I hope we're clear on that. And so, because
I don't particularly agree with that. I think the Christian claim is that God has revealed God's self in Christ, right? That's the Christian claim, that God has made God's self known, disclosed
but we don't know
God's
God,
self.
and we don't know how God revealed God's self in Christ in the way God understands that.
Okay, so but what we're saying is that God has truly disclosed God's self.
Well, we're not about whether or not it's true. I'm just talking about just at the epistemic level in terms of what we know and what we think we are knowing. And so all I'm saying is that if we, I think this should be fairly indisputable. We don't know God on God's own terms. However, God chooses to reveal God's self on God's terms to us. We don't actually know that. right? And so what I'm saying is that what that might mean for morality or not, I think, is that this is part of what I was suggesting, whether or not one believes in God or not. Like, you know, and we can think about it on an individual level, we think about it at a more structural, you know, level, more macro level, is that, I mean, there have been plenty of civilizations, plenty of communities, plenty of like groups of people who have various kinds of moralities with or without God and live a life that we would take to be decent. Like this, so now that's not to say, that may not be your preference, right? And so, but we can, democracy is, let me just go here for just a quick second, hopefully it's, listen,
You
even
gotta
the,
have a second.
I'll just try, because this open up another can of worms that we can't get into, is that, because I think oftentimes we just tie our conceptual morality to religion, and we don't understand that the way in which sort of we are socialized, that is a particular sort of like, we're socialized into etiquette. Etiquette is a we want to consider that something more non-moral, but it is a way of behavior, right? There's all ways in which our behavior is being shaped. Now, some of that we consider moral, some of it we consider non-moral. But if we don't know that distinction is being made, we don't realize how we're being shaped, how power is being exercised over us, right? At the level at which y'all sitting in y'all seat, y'all could be climbing up on this stage if y'all wanted to, but y'all been structured and disciplined to sit there.
Well, Lisa Fields is going to climb up on the stage and punch me in the face if I don't shut this conversation down. So I just want to take a second to say I appreciate everybody on the panel. You know, thank you for, you know, starting us off right, man. It's been a great conversation. Thank you to everybody who's come out and asked some really great questions. So
Fantastic moderator. Thank you.
all right.